Welcome back. In our prior section, we talked about building beautiful visualizations from some basic and essential chart types. In this section, we're going to focus on the use of maps, creating great maps to tell compelling stories. So we're going to learn the basics of how to create some powerful and engaging maps and use geographic-based data to tell some engaging stories to our viewers. And to provide a brief overview of what we're going to cover in this section, we'll begin with this introductory video and talk a little bit about map theory and some of the available tools that are out there. And then we'll focus in our second video on map data. How do we take data, prepare it for effective mapping, validate it, and go through the same sorts of exercises that we did with chart data. The following three videos are all going to cover specific types of map creations that we can work with. So these would include dot density maps, categorical maps, choropleth maps, and we'll talk some about creating dynamic maps if we've got multiple time periods. And then in the final two videos, we're going to talk about enhancing maps. So if we want to tell a story, the map's a great start, but we can tell a much better story if we add different features to the maps, such as titles and tooltips and annotations. And then finally, we'll look at sharing maps with the wider user community or the general public. So a very brief overview of mapping and what we can begin to do with it. So maps can be used for something as simple as a one category geographic display, let's say at the national or state or provincial level, and we've only got one data variable and maybe it's just a binary yes-no sort of map, or political party with two or more values overlaid. So something very simple. Or at the other extreme, we can have very powerful GIS or geographic information system output where we've got many variables that can be overlaid in a single map. We've got essentially two primary geographic structures that we work with in mapping. Point data, which is most often found by latitude and longitudinal coordinates, and then boundary files or shape files or polygons, all meaning essentially the same thing. So those would be boundaries at the national, state, provincial, county level as examples. We can also take raw address data and put it through a geocoding tool, run some processes on it, and convert it into useful mapping information. And finally, there's a real abundance of tools out there, not only for the geocoding process, but for the actual creation of maps. And we've got a couple desktop tools I'll mention here. There are many more available. QGIS, a very powerful desktop tool. Map Window in a very similar vein. And then more web-based tools we've got with Carto, Leaflet, and Mapbox. So now let's move into understanding our map data. So why is it important to understand and prep the map data that we've located or been given, and we want to create a useful map out of the data? Well, just as we saw with the chart data previously, it's very important to understand the map data for a variety of reasons. One of the foremost is to validate it. So data is not always clean. In fact, it's very frequently not clean. So we want to go through, and before providing maps to the end user, we'd like to identify if there's bad data in there, unusual or unexpected issues within the data set. Secondly, if we know our map data well, it's going to immediately lead us to the right type of map display. So if we know we've got point data, we're likely to go in the direction of a dot density map. If we've got discrete categories that we want to compare, then we'll create a categorical map. If we've got different value levels or gradations, then a choropleth map is ideal for showing those. And then if we've got time elements, we can create dynamic maps out of some of the prior categories, such as dot density or choropleth. And then if we've got our map data properly vetted and validated, then we've got a story that we can stand behind with confidence. We know the data is good, it's going to tell a valid story, and it's going to make it more engaging because there won't be any errors in it. The user can just engage immediately with the story that we've produced through the map. And adding on to that, mapping is just a great way to reach audiences visually. People recognize maps. They've often grown up seeing maps. So putting a map in front of them is generally a very good way to engage the user's interest. So to summarize why we should spend our time understanding map data, and very simply, it enables us to design great maps and to do it with confidence. And then knowing the data very thoroughly lets us construct a story much more easily. We won't be fumbling around trying to tell a story. We'll be confident in the data. We'll understand all the different directions we can go with our storytelling. So now let's look at a couple of examples of mapping data. So we'll open up an example here from City of Detroit, Michigan, and a vacancy index from a few years back. And what we've got here is polygon data. So that's our geometry, and it's telling us information such as the size of the polygon. And we've got very irregular boundaries if we were to view this within a map, which we'll see later. We've got some other supporting data, such as which council district they're in, and different IDs and so forth. And then, importantly, for actually showing the data, we'll have different numbers and percentages that we can ultimately put on the map that coincide with each of these polygons. So the percent of structures likely occupied, as an example, or likely vacant. We've got a few different ways we could go, but for the moment, that's a typical polygon sort of data set. Now we'll look at another data set, going back to Los Angeles crimes data set that we've previously used. And this is based on point data, wherever and whenever the data points are available. And now you see the geometry here is based on longitudinal and latitudinal data. So now we can plot these points directly on a map. We don't need different geographic boundaries. They may lie within a specific boundary, but we can actually plot a very specific data point. And you can see how these are linked to specific address sort of information as we go out further. So we've got different address info, sometimes less specific than other times, but very specific data for putting on a map and showing data points. So two very different data types there. So to summarize this section, map data should be thoroughly validated before we share our maps with our end users for credibility purposes and also for understanding what's in the data set before we begin to build our maps. And that's going to help us to design not only the best type of map, but to understand which data is going to tell the best story. So in the previous example with the Detroit vacancy data, we may choose to show the percent occupied or the percent unoccupied. One of them may tell a more interesting story for our viewers. And finally, if we've got valid data that we're confident in, we've got a very powerful medium to communicate through maps so our users can truly understand the patterns in the data.